Tonight, we journey into the past to uncover the remarkable lives and quiet resilience of medieval peasants. These were the everyday people who, against incredible odds, found ways to endure some of the most brutal nights in history. Through clever tricks of insulation and strategies of communal sleeping, their story unfolds as one of grit, ingenuity, and sheer determination. So, find a comfortable position, let the world outside grow quiet, and allow your mind to drift as we begin our story. When we think of medieval life, our minds often conjure images of jousting knights, magnificent feasts, and festive fairs. But for the common peasant, winter was not a time of merriment. Instead, it was dominated by a desperate, daily question. How do we survive the night? The season was an annual test of endurance, a harsh trial with no room for error. Imagine living in a small hut made of mud and sticks, with walls so thin you might hear a bird stirring outside. There was no insulation and no real windows, save for a small opening perhaps covered with a piece of animal skin. There was certainly no thermostat to adjust. The temperature inside the home was often only a few degrees warmer than the freezing conditions outside. The nights were the most difficult part. As darkness consumed the land, the wind would whistle through the countless cracks in the walls, and the small fire in the hearth would sputter. It did its best to offer warmth, but it mostly managed to warm the feet of whoever sat closest. For those on the other side of the single room, the chill was inescapable, as if they were camping outdoors. Clothing offered little comfort. Peasants did not possess fine fur coats or plush blankets. They typically owned a couple of tunics made of rough-spun wool, and perhaps a cloak that carried the scent of the farm. Their greatest hope was that layering these garments would provide some protection from the cold. Beds were often little more than sacks filled with hay or straw, and they frequently shared this space with fleas and other small creatures. This persistent cold was not merely uncomfortable. It was a direct threat to life. Frostbite and hypothermia were constant dangers, especially for the very young and the elderly. Waking up each morning, still breathing, was a small miracle worth celebrating, perhaps with a meager breakfast of a slightly less frozen turnip. Surviving a medieval winter had nothing to do with comfort. It was about clenching your teeth, piling on every piece of fabric you owned, huddling close to your family and even your livestock, and hoping you would not wake to find ice in your hair. If you imagine a drafty home today, a medieval peasant's dwelling would seem like a wind tunnel with a roof. Most of these houses were constructed using a method known as wattle and daub. This meant weaving a frame of sticks, like a large basket, and then smearing it with a mixture of mud, straw, and animal dung. The dung, while unpleasant to consider, was an inexpensive and effective binding agent and insulator, and it was always readily available. Yet, these walls stood little chance against a fierce winter storm. The cold air would find every gap and crevice, dancing into their one-room homes, ensuring no one ever felt truly warm. There was no privacy, little warmth, but a great deal of character building. The roofs posed their own set of challenges. Thatched roofs, while picturesque, would sag and leak after months of rain and snow, sometimes allowing small animals from the local wildlife to visit unexpectedly. Windows, when they existed at all, were incredibly small and usually covered with thin animal hides or wooden shutters. Glass was a luxury so great that even the lord of the manor might only afford a single tiny pane. For a peasant, it was a victory if the wind didn't tear the covering from the wall during a blizzard. To make matters worse, the floors were often just compacted earth. When it rained or snowed, this dirt floor would turn to mud. In the winter, every step inside your own home could feel like walking through a frozen marsh. The cold came from below, from above, and from all sides, a relentless assault on body heat. But the peasants were resourceful. They packed gaps with moss, stuffed rags into the worst of the drafts, and huddled close together, using their collective body heat as a final layer of insulation. Creativity and stubbornness were often the only things standing between a family and the unforgiving cold. As if the freezing air were not enough, medieval peasants also had to contend with an enemy rising from the ground itself. The floors in their homes were not what we would recognize today. They were simply packed earth, sometimes covered with a scattering of straw or old rushes for a faint illusion of comfort. But the cold from the ground was relentless. It would seep upwards, through the straw and into the bones of anyone trying to sleep. Fighting this chill was a constant battle. One method was to lay down thick mats of straw, which could provide a barrier against the cold. However, straw would quickly flatten and grow moldy, and it created a rustling sound with every movement. Some households used dried rushes instead, layering new ones on top of the old. Over time, this created a damp, living carpet of decomposing plants and insects. Beds, for those fortunate enough to have them, were not much of an improvement. They were typically wooden frames packed with more straw or hay. Instead of a soft mattress, one had a poking, shifting surface that did little to block the cold radiating from below. Tossing and turning was not about finding a comfortable position, but a desperate dance to keep blood flowing to every part of the body. In truth, peasants did not conquer the icy ground so much as they learned to live uncomfortably above it. A good night's sleep wasn't measured in dreams or softness, but in waking up with all of your fingers and toes still attached. If a medieval home had a hero during the winter, it was the hearth. This crackling fire pit was the only real defense against the cold and the darkness. At the center of nearly every peasant home was a simple fire, often just a pit or a collection of stones. There was no fireplace with an elegant mantel, and most homes did not even have a chimney. The smoke simply drifted upwards, finding its way out through holes in the roof or cracks in the walls, often after filling the room and the lungs of its inhabitants. It was far from ideal for breathing, but it did have the side effect of fumigating the home of fleas and other pests. The hearth was more than just a source of warmth. It was the kitchen, the only source of light after sunset, and the center of family life. People would gather around the fire to tell stories, share gossip, or simply stare into the flames when there was little else to do. Keeping this fire alive was essential. To let it die out at night was to invite the cold to overwhelm the home. Reigniting a fire in the winter was an arduous task, requiring flint, steel, and a great deal of patience. Every member of the family had a duty to tend to the fire, stoking the embers and adding fuel, whether it was peat, sticks, or a precious piece of dry wood. The hearth was a smoky, sputtering, and often disappointing little fire, but in a medieval winter, it was the beating heart of hope. There was one thing medieval peasants feared more than almost anything: letting the fire go out overnight. Restarting it in the dead of winter could be a life-or-death struggle. With no matches or lighters, it required striking flint against steel, hoping to catch a single spark in some dry tinder, all while your fingers were numb with cold. To avoid this, peasants developed a clever technique. They banked the fire. This meant carefully burying the glowing embers under a mound of ash before going to sleep. The ash acted as a blanket, insulating the coals and keeping them alive, just barely, until morning. With a bit of luck, one could simply poke the ash pile at sunrise, add some fresh kindling, and bring the fire back to life. Banking the fire was an art form, passed down through generations. Everyone had their own secrets and methods, debating whether the ash should be dry or damp, packed tightly or left loose. Sometimes, even a well-banked fire couldn't survive a strong gust of wind. In those cases, families would take turns staying awake through the night to check on the coals, a medieval version of a thermostat check. It was a constant struggle, but waking up to even a single surviving ember was a victory, one that gave them the strength to face another cold day. In medieval times, the saying, "the more, the merrier," was a winter survival tactic. When the fire dwindled and the wind howled, the most reliable source of warmth was each other. Entire households would pile into the warmest part of the room, wrapping themselves in whatever scraps of cloth they had, forming a great, snoring pile of humanity. Personal space was not a concept. The goal was simply not to freeze. The youngest children would be squeezed between their parents, and grandparents would be nestled within the layers. If a relative arrived unexpectedly, room would always be made for one more. The most coveted spot was in the middle of the pile, where body heat radiated from all sides. The least fortunate were on the edge, exposed to the drafts. Sharing bedding was also common, with multiple generations sleeping on a single straw mattress. Given the state of hygiene at the time, It was not the most pleasant-smelling arrangement, but against the threat of frostbite, such concerns faded away. This was not just about survival, it became a part of family bonding. Long winter nights huddled together were filled with stories, songs, and quiet conversation, muffled under a shared woolen blanket. If you thought sharing a room with family was a challenge, medieval peasants would introduce you to their other winter housemates. Cows, goats, pigs, and chickens. Bringing animals indoors was not a strange custom. It was vital. Livestock generated a significant amount of body heat, and in a poorly insulated home, every degree mattered. It also offered the practical benefit of protecting the animals from thieves during the night. The house at night became a chaotic, living furnace. Chickens would nest in the corners, pigs would snort contentedly near the hearth, and cows would lounge against the walls. The smells were, by all accounts, legendary. But peasants knew an uncomfortable truth. The more animals they brought inside, the warmer the home would be. Certain animals even had preferred spots. Cows, being the largest and warmest, were often near the family. Goats, with their nimble and curious nature, would find their way inside regardless. Chickens would roost in the rafters, and pigs would settle wherever they pleased. Of course, sharing your home with livestock came with its own hazards. One might be awakened by a chicken deciding your hair was a nest, or by stepping into something unpleasant in the morning darkness. Still, despite the noise and the smells, peasants understood the simple math. Cold could be fatal, and a warm animal was a welcome companion in the fight against it. In medieval winters, fashion was not about style. It was about survival. Peasants layered up as if preparing for battle. The rule was simple. If you owned a piece of clothing, you wore it, sometimes all at once. The first layer was a scratchy linen undertunic. Over that went a thicker woolen tunic, and another one if you had it. This was followed by leggings, a rough cloak, and perhaps a patched-up sheepskin thrown over the top. Boots were a luxury. Many peasants simply wrapped their feet in layers of cloth and stuffed them into wooden clogs. If the cold still managed to bite through, they would just add another rag and hope for the best. Washing these layers was almost out of the question. It meant a trip to a frozen stream, breaking through the ice, and then waiting days for the garment to dry. Most decided that smelling of smoke, sweat, and farm animals was a small price to pay for staying warm. Interestingly, the buildup of dirt and grease on clothing had an unintended benefit. It acted as insulation. This grimy layer helped to lock in body heat and block the wind. Hats, scarves, and gloves were treasured possessions. A simple woolen cap could make the difference between a tolerable night and a dangerous one. Children were swaddled in so many layers they resembled turnips, waddling awkwardly around the house. Style was irrelevant. Warmth was the only thing that mattered. In the medieval peasant's world, dirt was a tool. Getting grimy was not a sign of neglect, but a tactical decision. Clean clothes, particularly freshly laundered linen, were surprisingly poor at retaining heat. Their breathable nature was a liability when the air temperature was dangerously low. That's where dirt became useful. As days turned into weeks without washing, layers of grime, body oils, and mud would build up on their clothing. This natural coating clogged the gaps in the fabric, making the garments more wind-resistant. Some medieval people even believed that washing too often in winter could make you sick. It was better to keep that protective layer of filth intact. Bathing was rare, and laundry was even rarer. Soap, when available, was reserved for the most important occasions. This strategy of layering also meant you simply threw a new garment on top of yesterday's and the day before's. To an outsider, it might have seemed unhygienic, but the peasants understood that a grimy, crusty tunic was a shield against the cold. In a world where everyone carried a similar scent, it was simply a part of life. If you imagined medieval peasants sleeping in plush feather beds, the reality was far more rustic. Their beds were usually a rough wooden frame, if they could afford one, covered with a large sack stuffed with straw, hay, or old rushes. There was no memory foam, no orthopedic support, just a crunchy, lumpy pile that smelled of the barn. Every toss and turn was accompanied by the sound of crinkling straw and the occasional jab from a stray stalk. Some peasants skipped the frame altogether, throwing the straw directly onto the dirt floor, an experience one might call earth-connected slumber. These straw mattresses were not only uncomfortable, they were also temporary. The straw would flatten, grow moldy, and attract insects. Changing it was a significant chore, done only a few times a year. Rushes were a popular alternative, often mixed with herbs like lavender or rosemary to mask the other overwhelming odors of daily life. For a day, they might smell pleasant, but they soon became part of the trampled landscape of the floor. Fleas, lice, and other critters loved this bedding. Waking up scratching was an authentic part of the medieval experience. Yet, these humble beds were lifesavers. A thick pile of straw provided a crucial layer of insulation against the frozen ground, and huddling together on top of it created pockets of shared body heat. Living in a house made of sticks and mud, you quickly learned that winter drafts are a personal attack. Medieval peasants fought the cold not just from the outside, but from within their own homes, armed with anything they could find to cram into the cracks. And there were always cracks. Walls would warp, mud would crumble, and the thatch on the roof would sag. Sealing the house was an ongoing art form. They stuffed gaps with moss, straw, scraps of cloth, and even animal hair. Some would daub extra layers of mud and dung on the outside of their walls as an annual winter project, a miserable task performed in freezing weather. Roof leaks were another constant battle. Thatch was not waterproof, and peasants would plug holes with more cloth, bundles of reeds, or even chunks of turf. Doors and windows were little more than wooden planks hung on iron nails. Openings for windows were often covered with animal hides or thick cloth soaked in animal fat to block the drafts. Every night was a struggle between human ingenuity and the relentless, creeping cold. Yet, through cleverness and stubbornness, they patched and stuffed their way through the worst of the winter. When the cold was so intense it kept everyone awake, peasants had another strategy: sleeping in shifts. It was a simple and desperate system. Half the household would stay awake, tending the fire and patching drafts, while the other half tried to get a few hours of sleep under thin blankets. The fire required constant attention, so someone always had to be on ember patrol. Families rotated the duty. You would doze for a few hours, then be nudged awake to stumble over to the hearth and coax the fire back to life, all while trying not to step on a goat. There were no snooze buttons, only stiff joints and heavy eyelids. Even children old enough to hold a stick were put to work. Grandparents often took longer shifts, their experience valuable and their arthritis making it difficult to get up and down. Getting quality rest was a near miracle, but the system worked. The fire, and by extension the family, survived. The cold was so pervasive that peasants even had to think about how they breathed to stay alive. They learned to adjust their breathing to survive the night. The problem was simple. Deep, open-mouthed breaths pulled icy air directly into the lungs, a serious risk in a world where pneumonia was often fatal. So they learned what might be called survival breathing. They kept their breaths shallow, slow, and, most importantly, through the nose. This would gently warm the air before it hit their lungs. Some people even tucked parts of their cloaks or shawls over their faces while they slept, creating a makeshift filter. It meant waking with a damp patch of fabric over your mouth, but it was better than freezing from the inside out. Children were taught these tricks from a young age. At night, tucked into straw bedding, breathing became an art form. Slow, steady, and as minimal as possible. It was not a glamorous strategy, but it worked one shallow breath at a time. In the endless fight against the medieval winter, peasants discovered an unlikely weapon: a full stomach. It turns out that one of the best ways to fend off the cold was to eat a hearty, heavy meal right before bed. Calories meant warmth. The more the body had to work to digest food, the more heat it generated. It was a simple form of thermodynamics: eat a heavy meal, and you might just survive until morning. The evening meal would consist of thick stews heavy with root vegetables like turnips and parsnips. Grains were also vital in the form of oat porridge, barley gruel, or dense rye bread. If they were lucky, a piece of salted pork or sausage might be added to the pot. It was a meal designed to sit in the gut like a warm brick, slowly burning through the night. It wasn't just about eating a lot. It was about eating smart. Foods that took longer to digest, especially fatty foods, provided a slow and steady release of warmth. A belly full of stew and bread was a peak winter luxury. Parents made sure every child ate their fill, regardless of picky habits. Of course, a heavy meal came with its own side effects, like vivid dreams, but it was a small price to pay for survival. Long before electric blankets, peasants found other ways to bring a little extra warmth to their beds. This is where the humble haybox and the heated stone became winter's unsung heroes. The haybox was a simple but brilliant invention. It was a sturdy wooden box, lined thickly with hay, used to keep cooked food warm for hours. A pot of stew, placed in the haybox, would stay hot for a late-night meal. But peasants soon realized that if hay could trap the heat from a stew pot, it could also trap the heat from rocks. Before bed, someone would place a flat stone in the fire. Once it was intensely hot, they would carefully fish it out, wrap it in rags, and slip it under the hay in their mattress. It was a medieval heating pad. There were risks, of course. An improperly wrapped stone could start a fire, but when it worked, it provided hours of comforting warmth. In a peasant's home, the hearth was the center of everything, especially at night. Sleeping arrangements were determined by strategic positioning relative to the fire. Infants, the elderly, and the sick were given the prime real estate closest to the flames. Parents and older children would form an insulating layer around them. It was a delicate balance. Too close and you risked getting singed. Too far and you were left in the cold. The fire's warmth was not evenly distributed. It mostly roasted those directly in front of it, while everyone else vied for a share of the heat. Pets and livestock would also muscle in for a spot. Every crackle of the logs was a small promise that you were still alive, still warm, at least for now. No one survived a medieval winter alone. It was a village project, a messy and loud collaboration where everyone's life depended on their neighbors. If a family's fire went out, it was an emergency. A neighbor might rush over with a glowing coal wrapped in rags, or even invite the family into their own overcrowded hut for the night. Villages had unofficial winter watchers, often the young or the elderly, who kept an eye on who was sick or whose chimney had stopped smoking. Communal food stores were sometimes pooled during the harshest times. Even children understood the stakes and would help deliver wood or run urgent messages. Old feuds were often set aside when the nights grew deadly cold. A rival was still worth saving because tomorrow you might be the one in need of rescue. In the icy heart of winter, the village became one large, stubborn family, fiercely determined to survive together. When peasants faced the merciless cold, they didn't just stoke the fire, they also prayed. Faith was woven into every frozen breath. Before sleep, families would kneel together, offering prayers to keep the fire burning and their family safe until morning. Saints became the frontline defense against the dangers of winter. They would pray to Saint Blaise to protect them from throat ailments, a serious concern when inhaling icy air. Superstitions were also common. Some families sprinkled holy water near the hearth or marked their doorways with blessed chalk, pleading for warmth and luck. Faith was not an abstract comfort but an urgent, daily conversation. They asked not for luxury, but for survival. A little heat, a little food, and one more day. For all their ingenuity and stubbornness, sometimes it was not enough. Some winters were so cruel that they took entire families, leaving villages silent beneath a shroud of snow. The Great Famine Winter of 1315 was one such time, when relentless rains destroyed crops and freezing temperatures created a grinding disaster. A fire going out was often a death sentence. In the spring, neighbors might find entire families still huddled together, frozen in a final embrace. Houses could collapse under heavy snow, and disease flourished in the cramped, smoky homes. A simple cough in December could become a funeral by January. Frostbite claimed fingers, toes, and ears, leaving grim reminders for those who survived. Death was an expected visitor in winter, and yet, amid the bitter cold, the peasants pressed on, grieving and clinging to life, because as long as one ember remained in the hearth, there was still a fight worth fighting. When we look back at these frostbitten survivors, it is easy to see only their hardship. But beneath the struggle lies a legacy of raw ingenuity and unbreakable endurance. They had no central heating or thermal jackets. They had no guarantee of surviving until spring. But what they did have was a blueprint for resilience. Every hay-stuffed mattress, every banked fire, and every moss-crammed gap in the wall was a testament to human creativity under pressure. They adapted, learning from the land and from each other. Their communities were built on shared survival. They understood that no one beats winter alone. Their faith was also a form of endurance, a fragile but stubborn hope that after 100 dark nights, spring would come again. And somehow it always did. Because of their unglamorous victories, future generations were able to thrive. Every cozy blanket and warm house we enjoy today is, in some small way, the result of countless medieval peasants who simply refused to give in to the cold. And Bullen did not enter the world destined for a throne. Born around 1501 to Thomas Bullen, an ambitious diplomat, and Elizabeth Howard, a woman from a noble family, her birth caused little stir in Tudor society. Yet from these relatively modest beginnings, a life was taking shape that would one day change the course of English history. From an early age, Anne was set apart not by her status, but by her intelligence. She was clever, spirited, and possessed a magnetic personality. Recognizing her potential, her family sent her to the continent for her education, an opportunity few English girls could imagine. First, she served in the glittering court of Margaret of Austria in the Netherlands. There, Anne absorbed the arts of diplomacy, refined manners, and the subtle dance of European politics. But it was in France that her brilliance was truly polished. She spent years in the sophisticated courts of Queen Claude and Queen Marguerite of Navarre, mastering the language of influence, elegance, and wit. While other young women were perfecting their embroidery, Anne was mastering conversation, intrigue, and the art of commanding a room without ever appearing to seek attention. When she returned to England in the early 1520s, Anne was a rare commodity, a woman with the sophistication of a continental courtier and the ambition of a rising English family. She was not a classic beauty, but she was captivating, with dark eyes that sparked with intelligence and a quick, musical voice. And did not just enter a room, she changed its center of gravity. At a time when a woman's fate was usually determined by birth and marriage, and refused to drift into obscurity. She had seen the power that charm and intellect could wield, and she intended to use that knowledge. The young woman who returned to England was no longer just Thomas Bullen's daughter. She was a player in a game that would soon involve the crown itself. Upon her return to the English court, Anne was unlike anyone the nobility had seen. In a world of modest English roses, Anne was a thunderstorm, electric and impossible to ignore. Her dark hair, bold eyes, and sharp wit set her apart. At first, she served as a maid of honor to Queen Catherine of Aragon. But even in the Queen's shadow, Anne's presence was undeniable. She danced with grace, spoke French with ease, and laughed with a confidence few women dared to show. It wasn't long before she caught the most dangerous eye of all, that of King Henry VIII. Henry was no stranger to flirtation, but Anne was different. She did not swoon at his compliments or fall eagerly into his advances. She teased, she challenged, and she refused him. Henry, a man accustomed to getting whatever he wanted, was captivated. The more Anne kept him at a distance, the more infatuated he became. He offered her the powerful position of royal mistress, but astonishingly, Anne said no. She would not be just another conquest. If Henry wanted her, he would have to make her his wife. It was an audacious gamble. The king was already married to Queen Catherine, who was beloved by the people and protected by powerful allies. The church itself stood in the way, but Anne did not flinch. She had seen how queens wielded power in the courts of Europe, and she was determined to win this dangerous game. What started as a flirtation between the king and Anne Boleyn soon escalated into a national crisis. Henry, consumed by his obsession, was willing to tear apart the fabric of English society. His desire to marry and faced one major obstacle: his current wife, Queen Catherine of Aragon. Dignified and resilient, Catherine refused to step aside quietly. She had been Henry's wife for 2 decades and was, in the eyes of the people and the church, the rightful queen. But Henry was determined. He convinced himself that his marriage to Catherine was invalid because she had previously been married to his late brother, Arthur. He ignored the fact that the Pope had granted special permission for their union years before, now insisting his soul was in peril, and meanwhile played her part masterfully. She remained just out of reach, fueling Henry's hopes while maintaining her virtue. Every glance and every word was carefully measured. She was not just aiming for marriage. She was positioning herself to be the Queen of England. The court split into factions. Some nobles, sensing a shift in power, eagerly supported Anne. Others remained fiercely loyal to Queen Catherine, horrified by the prospect of her being replaced. As months turned into years, Henry's frustration grew. He sent petition after petition to the Pope, but the Church would not yield, partly due to the influence of Catherine's powerful nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. Still, Henry pressed on, defying tradition and law. His courtship of Anne had become a challenge to the entire political and religious structure of England. A dangerous game had begun, and there was no turning back. After nearly 7 years of scandal and diplomatic chaos, Anne Boleyn's gamble finally paid off. In January 1533, she secretly married Henry VIII, even though he was, in the eyes of Rome, still married to Catherine of Aragon. By June, Anne was crowned Queen of England at Westminster Abbey. It should have been her ultimate triumph, but the atmosphere was tense. The people of London watched with weary eyes. Some cheered, but many muttered prayers for Queen Catherine. They wondered if this new queen, with her French manners and daring spirit, was a blessing or a curse, and began her reign not as a beloved figure, but as a storm. Unlike the humble and pious Catherine, Anne was dazzling, provocative, and politically astute. She wore bold colors, commanded the court with sharp intelligence, and quickly made powerful enemies. Her position, though seemingly secure, was incredibly fragile. Everything depended on one thing: providing Henry with a male heir, and knew this better than anyone. She was no longer just Henry's love interest. She was the future of his dynasty. Early in her pregnancy, both she and Henry were certain the child would be a boy. But in September 1533, Anne gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, and masked her crushing disappointment with grace, insisting the next child would be a son. Henry, however, was less composed. The adoration in his eyes began to flicker with doubt. Still, for a time, Anne's influence was immense. She reshaped the court in her image, elevating her family to new heights. She was the first queen in English history to be crowned with the sacred oil traditionally reserved for kings. To solidify her position, Henry officially broke with the Catholic Church, creating the Church of England with himself as its head. This ensured that Anne's crown could not be questioned by Rome. Yet, even in her moment of triumph, dark clouds were gathering. Rivals circled, waiting for an opportunity. And Henry, a fickle and restless man, was already beginning to look beyond the brilliant woman for whom he had remade a kingdom. And Boleyn had climbed higher than almost any woman of her time. But the higher one rises, the harder the fall. The cracks in her world began to show almost immediately. The relentless pressure to produce a male heir was at the heart of her struggles. Her first child, Elizabeth, while bright and healthy, was not the son Henry so desperately wanted, and endured several more pregnancies, but they ended in heartbreaking miscarriages, leaving her physically and emotionally drained. Each loss chipped away at the foundation of her power. Henry, once so passionately devoted, began to distance himself, his disappointment creating a rift between them. And, never one to suffer in silence, argued and fought to maintain her position. But Henry, who valued obedience, grew tired of her sharpness, the very quality that had once enchanted him. Outside the royal chambers, her enemies were gathering. Many nobles who had grudgingly accepted her rise now openly schemed against her. Supporters of Catherine of Aragon never forgave her. Even the common people whispered against her, blaming her for the break with Rome. Then came Jane Seymour, quiet, demure, and everything and was not. Jane captured Henry's wandering eye just as Anne's influence was beginning to fade. Where Anne offered brilliance and challenge, Jane offered soothing compliance. It was a dangerous shift, and an ever-perceptive saw it happening. She tried to reclaim her position, but the king had already begun to imagine a life without her. Anne's political enemies, including her former ally Thomas Cromwell, sensed the changing tide. They began to lay the groundwork for her destruction, quietly gathering accusations and rumors. The queen who had played the game of ambition so masterfully was now losing ground. And Boleyn's enemies did not attack with armies, but with whispers and carefully constructed lies. In the back rooms of the court, a silent and deadly betrayal was brewing. Thomas Cromwell, once her greatest ally, had turned against her. Their alliance, built on mutual ambition, had fractured. Anne's boldness had become a liability. In Henry's fickle heart, love had soured into irritation and suspicion. She had few true friends left. And Jane Seymour, quiet and calculating, waited in the wings, the perfect contrast to Anne's fading fire. It was Cromwell who made the first move. He knew Henry wanted an exit but needed a convenient excuse. Cromwell offered a solution. What if Anne were removed not by divorce, which would be another humiliation for the king, but by disgrace? The accusations were monstrous. Adultery, incest, and conspiracy against the king. Cromwell carefully gathered evidence, extracting confessions under torture and twisting courtly flirtations into damning testimony. Several men, including Anne's own brother, George Boleyn, were arrested. The charges were riddled with contradictions, but in Henry's court, the truth was whatever the king needed it to be. And, sensing the tightening noose, fought desperately. She appealed to Henry, reminding him of the love they once shared, but it was no use. The man who had torn a kingdom apart for her now refused to even meet her gaze. In May 1536, Anne was arrested and taken to the Tower of London. As the great gates slammed shut behind her, she understood the truth. She was no longer a queen but a prisoner, a pawn in the brutal game she had once played so well. And Boleyn stood in the great hall of the Tower of London, facing a tribunal of nobles, many of whom owed their positions to her. Now they sat in cold judgment, ready to erase her from history. The charges were read aloud. Adultery with multiple men, high treason, conspiracy. It was a grim performance designed to give Henry VIII exactly what he wanted. Anne's downfall, cloaked in a thin veil of legality, and defended herself with the same fire that had once captivated the king. She denied every accusation with intelligence and unwavering composure that stunned even her enemies. She reminded them that she was their anointed queen, but it was futile. The verdict had been decided long before the trial began. Witness after witness, many of them coerced, spoke damning words. The evidence was flimsy and contradictory, but the truth was irrelevant. Anne was found guilty. Her brother George and the other accused men were also sentenced to death, and would be executed by beheading, a so-called merciful sentence. When the verdict was read, Anne did not break. She stood tall, her face pale but her spirit intact. She declared that she was prepared to die and prayed that God would have mercy on her soul. As the heavy doors closed behind her, the court breathed a sigh of relief. The storm that was Anne Boleyn was nearly over. But they did not understand. They were not erasing her. They were immortalizing her in tragedy and legend. After her trial, Anne was returned to the Tower, not as a queen, but as a condemned prisoner. Yet even in the face of death, she refused to crumble. She spent her final hours in prayer, kneeling on the hard stone floors. She confessed to no crimes, for she believed she had committed none. She said she was not afraid to die, but prayed for the peace of the kingdom and for her young daughter, Elizabeth. Her loyal ladies-in-waiting wept, but Anne comforted them. She even joked bitterly that she would be remembered as a queen who had lost her head. Henry VIII showed no mercy. He had already turned his full attention to Jane Seymour, arranging his next marriage even before Anne's execution date was set. This final betrayal must have been the deepest cut of all. On May 18, 1536, Anne was told she would die the next morning. As a final, strange act of kindness, Henry arranged for a French swordsman to carry out the execution, as a sword was considered faster and cleaner than an axe. At dawn, and dressed carefully in a dark gray gown trimmed with fur, she pinned up her dark hair beneath a simple cap, ready to face the blade with grace. As the morning mist curled around the tower courtyard, and Bullen stepped forward, there would be no tears, no pleas, only a final act of courage. On the morning of May 19, 1536, and Bullen ascended the scaffold. A small crowd gathered in silence. She stood tall, her face pale but calm. She faced death with the same fierce dignity that had once shaken a kingdom. She spoke briefly, choosing her words with care. She did not accuse or defend herself. Instead, she prayed for the king's health and prosperity, the very man who had abandoned her. Her courage stunned the onlookers. The French executioner stepped forward and knelt upright, her hands folded in prayer. A cloth was tied around her eyes. The sword flashed once, silent and swift, and Bullen was no more. She was buried quickly in an unmarked grave within the tower, laid to rest in an arrow chest because no proper coffin had been prepared. A queen once crowned in gold was left to vanish without ceremony. Yet her story did not end in that cold grave. Her daughter, Elizabeth, the child whose birth had so disappointed a king, would rise to become one of the greatest monarchs in English history, Elizabeth I. She inherited her mother's fierce spirit, sharp mind, and unyielding resilience. And Bullen changed the course of England forever. Her ambition triggered the break with Rome and the birth of the Church of England. In the end, she won a kind of immortality, not through survival, but through her indelible impact on history. By the early 1770s, the American colonies were simmering with discontent. The relationship with Britain, once a source of pride, had soured into resentment and suspicion. The trouble had begun years earlier with laws like the Stamp Act, which taxed everything from newspapers to playing cards. Then came the Townshend Acts, taxing essentials like paper, glass, and paint. Each new law, passed by a distant parliament where the colonists had no voice, felt like another insult. At first, the anger was expressed through polite petitions and fiery pamphlets. Colonial assemblies drafted formal protests, and merchants organized boycotts. But as time went on, a darker realization took hold. Britain wasn't listening. It seemed Britain didn't care. The colonists weren't just angry about the money. The taxes themselves were relatively modest. It was the principle that infuriated them. They were being taxed without their consent, treated not as citizens, but as distant subjects to be ruled. Boston, more than any other city, became the heart of the resistance. A secretive and passionate group of patriots known as the Sons of Liberty grew louder and bolder. In 1770, tensions erupted into violence when British soldiers fired on a crowd of civilians in what became known as the Boston Massacre. Trust was gone. By 1773, the colonies were teetering on the edge of open defiance. The final push came not in the form of soldiers or new laws, but in the seemingly harmless shape of crates filled with tea. In 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act. It was a law designed to save the struggling British East India Company by allowing it to sell tea directly to the colonies. This cut out middlemen and slashed prices, offering a luxury product at a bargain. Parliament believed the colonists would quietly accept the cheaper tea. They were wrong. The problem was not the price. It was the principle. The Tea Act left the hated tax on tea in place. To accept the tea, even at a discount, would be to acknowledge Parliament's right to tax them without their consent. For many Americans, this was an unthinkable surrender of their liberties. News of the Tea Act spread like wildfire. Merchants were furious, seeing the act as a monopoly that would crush local trade. Patriots raged at the hidden message. The Crown still believed it could do as it pleased. In Boston, a city already scarred by the massacre, the reaction was especially fierce. Refusing the tea became a matter of honor. Public meetings swelled with angry citizens. Groups like the Sons of Liberty, led by Samuel Adams, organized boycotts, vowing that no East India Company tea would be unloaded or sold on American soil. Across the colonies, Ships carrying the controversial tea were turned away from ports in New York and Charleston. But in Boston, 3 ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, arrived in the harbor and refused to leave. Royal officials insisted the tea be unloaded. The colonists refused. Tense deadlock began. As the British tea ships sat anchored in Boston Harbor, the city transformed into a powder keg. In taverns and public squares, colonists debated their next move. The Sons of Liberty, led by figures like Samuel Adams, John Hancock, and Paul Revere, worked quickly to organize the resistance. They posted notices calling for boycotts and held raucous meetings that drew farmers, artisans, and merchants. The Old South Meeting House became the nerve center of the movement. Thousands crammed into the hall, their voices rising in defiance. But while the people of Boston stood united, time was running out. British law required that imported goods be unloaded and the tax paid within 20 days. If the deadline passed, customs officials could seize the cargo by force. The Sons of Liberty understood that once the tax was paid, even under protest, their cause would be lost. Meanwhile, the royal governor of Massachusetts, Thomas Hutchinson, refused to back down. He would not allow the tea ships to leave without unloading their cargo, determined to uphold the law. The city held its breath. Everyone knew something was about to happen. December 16, 1773, dawned gray and cold. It was the final day. The tea had to be unloaded. Thousands of Bostonians packed into the Old South Meeting House, some having walked for miles to be there. The crowd was so large it spilled into the streets. Samuel Adams presided over the meeting, as speaker after speaker denounced the Tea Act and urged action. As the afternoon wore on, a rider brought grim news. Governor Hutchinson would not yield. The ships would not be allowed to leave. The crowd buzzed with fury. Samuel Adams stood and spoke the words that signaled the end of debate. "This meeting can do nothing more to save the country." It was a simple sentence, but everyone understood its meaning. There would be no more petitions. Action would be taken. Outside, a war whoop cut through the evening gloom, a prearranged signal. Men began to disguise themselves, smearing soot on their faces and donning blankets and feathers in a crude imitation of Mohawk warriors. The disguise was not meant to fool anyone. It was a symbol, a message that could not be mistaken. The deadline had passed. Boston would answer not with words, but with defiance. As twilight fell, figures moved through the shadows of Boston. They were ordinary men, their faces blackened with soot, making their way to Griffin's Wharf where the 3 tea ships lay anchored. The harbor water was cold and dark. There was no shouting, no chaos. This was not a riot. It was a mission, carried out with calm, ruthless precision. Armed with hatchets, the disguised colonists swarmed the ships. The crew members were not harmed, merely pushed aside as the work began. The men split open the wooden chests, the fragrant smell of tea filling the night air. Crate after crate was heaved overboard, their heavy splashes echoing across the water. In total, 342 chests were broken and dumped, until the harbor swirled with thousands of pounds of tea leaves. Spectators watched from the wharf in silent awe. British guards stationed nearby did not intervene. The discipline of the participants was extraordinary. Nothing was stolen. No property was damaged, apart from the tea. The hated symbol of British oppression was the only target. When it was over, the men vanished back into the night, leaving behind no names, only the unmistakable mark of revolution. The morning after, the city awoke to the smell of salty tea. News of the event spread quickly. Among patriots, there was a swelling pride that ordinary men had stood up to a mighty empire. Among loyalists, there was horror. They saw the destruction of property as reckless and dangerous. Had the colonies crossed a line from which there was no return? Governor Hutchinson was furious, not just at the destruction, but at the message it sent about the king's authority. The financial loss was tallied at over 10,000 British pounds, a fortune at the time. But the real loss was measured in trust and loyalty, in the fragile illusion that Britain still ruled its colonies with their consent. The age of peaceful protest was ending. When news of the Boston Tea Party reached London, the reaction was swift and furious. To British officials, this was open rebellion. King George III grew cold with anger, and Parliament exploded in outrage. They demanded punishment not just for Boston, but as a warning to all the American colonies. The result was a series of harsh laws that became known in America as the Intolerable Acts. The first blow was the Boston Port Act, which ordered the closure of the city's bustling harbor until the destroyed tea was paid for. Trade vanished and supplies dried up. The Massachusetts Government Act then stripped the colony of its rights to self-governance, placing it under the direct control of the king's officials. To ensure compliance, British soldiers were quartered throughout Boston, living among the very citizens they were meant to subdue. The message was clear: rebellion would be crushed. But Parliament's heavy hand had an unintended effect. Instead of frightening the other colonies into submission, it outraged them. News of Boston's suffering stirred deep sympathy across America. Wagon loads of food and supplies poured into Boston from neighboring colonies. What had been a Massachusetts problem was quickly becoming an American one. In punishing Boston, Britain had hoped to make an example. Instead, they had created a martyr and a rallying cry for resistance. The punishment of Boston sent shockwaves far beyond Massachusetts. Across the 13 colonies, outrage turned into something far more dangerous for Britain: unity. For years, the colonies had been like distant, bickering cousins. But when Parliament closed Boston's harbor, Americans everywhere realized that if it could happen to Boston, it could happen to any of them. The fight was no longer Boston's alone. It was everyone's. In September 1774, the First Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia. For the first time, representatives from 12 of the 13 colonies gathered under one roof to plan a unified response. Men like George Washington, Patrick Henry, and John Adams, once regional figures, now stood together as architects of a growing movement. Their official goal was not yet independence. Most still hoped for reconciliation. But a deeper understanding was taking root. The colonies could no longer afford to stand separately. They agreed to a sweeping boycott of British goods and pledged mutual support. An attack on one colony would be considered an attack on all. In trying to crush the rebellion in Boston, Britain had inadvertently welded the colonies together into something far more dangerous: a people who were beginning to think of themselves as Americans. The Boston Tea Party lit a spark that no king or army could extinguish. In the months that followed, that spark caught fire. Protests and boycotts hardened into open resistance. Town militias began to drill, and storehouses were filled with powder and shot. Boston became a symbol of sacrifice, battered but unbowed. The more Britain tried to tighten its grip, the more the colonies slipped through its fingers. By the spring of 1775, tensions reached a boiling point. In the villages of Lexington and Concord, British troops sent to confiscate colonial weapons were met by armed farmers, ready to defend their rights. The first shots of the American Revolution rang out, their sound tracing a direct line back to that cold night in Boston Harbor. The Boston Tea Party showed the world that revolution does not always announce itself with trumpets. Sometimes it begins quietly, with a small group of determined people choosing defiance over fear. Long before the Great Pyramids of Giza, and before the cities of Mesopotamia buzzed with life, there was Carol. Hidden in the dry valleys of coastal Peru, this majestic city rose nearly 5,000 years ago, only to fade into near-complete oblivion, swallowed by sand and forgotten by time. For centuries, the world did not even know it existed. The Soup Valley, where Carol once thrived, seems an unlikely place for a civilization to bloom. The landscape is parched and barren, the river little more than a thin thread of silver. Yet it was here, in this desolate place, that one of humanity's earliest great cities took shape. Carol was not a scattered collection of huts. It was a planned city, sprawling over 150 acres, filled with pyramids, plazas, and ceremonial spaces. It was a complex society that blossomed centuries before the Egyptians began building their own pyramids. The people of Carol achieved all of this without the wheel, without a written language, and without metal tools. They built massive structures from stone and earth with nothing but ingenuity and communal effort. For thousands of years, Carol's existence remained a secret. Travelers who stumbled upon the strange, weathered mounds scattered across the valley mistook them for natural hills. No one imagined that beneath the sand lay one of the oldest cities in the world. It wasn't until the late 20th century that archaeologists, led by Ruth Shady, uncovered the truth. What they found would rewrite the story of the Americas and force the world to reconsider the birth of civilization itself. At first glance, the Soup Valley looks like a place where life should struggle. Harsh winds sweep across endless stretches of sand and stone, and the sun beats down without mercy. Water is scarce, but the people of Carol saw something different. They did not see a desert to be feared, but a canvas to be shaped. They recognized the modest river as the lifeblood of possibility. And so, with patience and ingenuity, they turned this unforgiving place into a thriving oasis. Their first victory was agriculture. They built brilliant, simple irrigation systems that channeled water from the river to their fields. Where others saw only dust, they coaxed life from the earth. Cotton, beans, squash, and sweet potatoes. Cotton became their treasure, spun into fishing nets and textiles that fueled trade with coastal villages. The people of Carol understood that survival in the desert required balance. They worked with nature, not against it. They built their homes from stone and earth, designed to withstand both scorching heat and rare, punishing rains. They studied the stars and planned their harvests with the precision of astronomers. Trade became the lifeblood of their economy. They exchanged their cotton and produce for dried fish from the coast, colorful shells from the Pacific, and rare stones from the Andes. They were not isolated. They were connected. In a land where survival seemed impossible, Carol thrived through intelligence, innovation, and community. Rising from the desert floor, the pyramids of Carol defy our expectations of early American civilizations. These were not small, crude structures, but massive, deliberate works of architecture. The centerpiece of the city was the Pyramid Mayor, the largest of its monuments. It stretched more than 450 feet in length and stood nearly 60 feet high, an engineering feat on par with the wonders of the ancient world. It was built from stone, mud, and woven reed bags filled with rocks, designed to withstand both the harsh climate and the region's earthquakes. But the pyramids of Carol were not tombs. Unlike the burial complexes of Egypt, they served a different purpose. They were centers of ceremony, power, and public life. Temples and gathering spaces crowned their summits, reached by broad, elegant staircases. Fires once burned on these platforms during rituals held beneath the vast Peruvian sky. At the foot of the pyramids, great sunken circular plazas opened up, inviting thousands to gather for religious ceremonies and communal celebrations. The city's design suggests a society that prized community and order. The pyramids themselves seem to have been strategically aligned with celestial events, like solstices and the cycles of the stars. To the people of Carol, architecture was not just practical. It was spiritual and cosmic. Among the ruins of Carol, there is something profoundly different from many other ancient civilizations. No weapons have been found buried in its sands. No defensive walls circle its plazas. No mass graves hint at bloody conquests. Unlike kingdoms that rose and fell through war, Carol appears to have been a society built on peace. It is a revelation that defies expectations. Here was a civilization that flourished not through violence, but through cooperation, trade, and shared belief. The people of Carol invested their energy not in armies, but in architecture, astronomy, and music. Their plazas were not monuments to victory, but centers for celebration and governance. This was a civilization that chose to gather rather than conquer. Trade was the key to Carol's success. The cotton they grew was traded with coastal communities for dried fish, an essential source of protein. This network of trade stitched the region together, binding communities in a web of mutual benefit. Religious and ceremonial life played a vital role in maintaining social harmony. Music filled their gatherings, with flutes carved from condor bones and drums made from deer hides. Leadership appeared to rely less on military strength and more on spiritual authority and civic organization. In an ancient world so often defined by conflict, Carol stands as a remarkable exception. a reminder that civilization can be built on the quiet power of collaboration and creativity. The stones of Carol still seem to hum with the echoes of a world long gone. It was a city alive with sound and spiritual rhythm. Archaeologists have uncovered a treasure trove of ancient instruments, flutes made from the bones of condors and pelicans, and small drums stretched with animal hides. In a world without writing, music was the language of the soul. Imagine the low thrum of drums rising at dusk, the sound of flutes carried on the desert wind, as hundreds gathered in the sunken plazas. The layout of the city itself, with its grand public spaces and circular courts, suggests that ritual was at its very core. These were stages for communal ceremonies, designed to bring people together. The pyramids loomed above, not as tombs, but as sacred mountains built by human hands, linking the earth to the heavens. Rituals likely marked the turning of the seasons and the cycles of the harvest. Music was a bridge between people, between nature and the divine. The spiritual world of Carol seems to have been one of harmony, celebration, and reverence. Carol was not just a place of music and trade. It was a marvel of engineering. Without metal tools, the wheel, or draft animals, its people shaped a city of stone that has endured for nearly 5,000 years. They transported enormous stones using shikras, ingenious woven reed bags strong enough to bear heavy loads. They built with care, creating structures that could withstand not only time, but nature's fury. Carol lies in a region prone to earthquakes, yet its pyramids survived largely intact. The builders used flexible construction techniques, wide foundations, and rounded corners that allowed their monuments to absorb seismic energy. It was engineering born from an intimate knowledge of the earth. Water management was another silent triumph. In a desert, the people of Carol developed sophisticated irrigation canals to guide river water to their fields, allowing crops to flourish. The city's layout reflected brilliant urban planning, with major structures aligned with key astronomical points. The sunken plazas, with their precise geometry, were not just gathering places, but instruments for tracking the heavens, allowing them to predict the seasons crucial for survival. As modern engineers marvel at Carol's resilience, they are reminded that greatness is not measured by technology alone. For centuries, the city of Carol flourished, and then quietly it was abandoned. There were no fires, no signs of conquest, no shattered monuments to tell a story of disaster. Carol simply faded away. Its plazas emptied, and its pyramids were left to the drifting sands. Why did the people leave? The question still lingers. Some scholars believe that climate change struck the final blow. A long period of drought may have crippled their agriculture. Without the river's life-giving water, the fields would have withered, and the trade networks that depended on their surplus would have collapsed. Other theories point to shifting trade routes, as new centers of power emerged along the coast. Perhaps Carol's influence simply diminished over time. Still, others whisper of internal decline. Without written records, we can only imagine political struggles or religious upheaval. Whatever the cause, the departure seems to have been gradual. Families likely drifted away one by one, seeking more fertile valleys and new beginnings. The desert reclaimed what humans had built. For nearly 4,000 years, Carol remained hidden, a whisper beneath the sands. For millennia, Carol lay forgotten. Travelers passed the strange, rounded hills, never suspecting that the ruins of a great civilization lay beneath their feet. It wasn't until the 1990s that Peruvian archaeologist Ruth Shady led a team into the Soup Valley, driven by a suspicion that these hills held secrets. What they found would rewrite the story of the Americas. Layer by painstaking layer, the sand was brushed away, revealing walls of cut stone, grand staircases, and sunken plazas. A city far older than anyone had imagined. Radiocarbon dating confirmed the unbelievable. Carol was over 4,600 years old, thriving at the same time as the earliest civilizations in Mesopotamia and Egypt. It was a discovery that shook the foundations of archaeology. Before Carol, it was believed that civilization in the Americas developed much later. Carol proved that monumental architecture and complex urban life had arisen independently in the Americas, long before the Incas or the Mayans. Ruth Shady and her team found not just stones, but the remnants of a vibrant life. Musical instruments, textiles, and even ancient knot records known as quipu. Each artifact told the story of a people who had built a society with vision, intelligence, and profound creativity. Carol's rediscovery was a resurrection. A civilization that had slept for thousands of years now stood revealed once more. Carol stands today as a silent giant, a reminder that civilization's roots run deeper than we once believed. It tells a story not of conquest, but of harmony and ingenuity. In an era often defined by conflict, Carol offers another vision of what civilization can be. A society that valued connection over conquest, knowledge over domination. It challenges the old assumption that civilization had a single cradle in the old world. It proves that humanity's spirit of innovation arose independently in many corners of the earth, driven by the same eternal desires: to endure, to celebrate, and to reach for something greater. Walking among Carol's weathered ruins, you can almost hear the pulse of drums and the low hum of flutes. Their dreams are still with us, etched into the bones of the earth. Carol teaches us that even when civilizations fall, their spirit can endure, waiting to be remembered and waiting to inspire again.